Welcome to Tossing Grenades at Windmills. Windmills.
Hi, and welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. My name is TC Ricks. Recently, my microphone died, and Matt Franklin was kind enough to help me take care of it while I was gone. He did such a good job that I'm actually going to have him finish the rest of Grenademan vs. the Zombies over the course of the next year. I'll be reading every other week, and look forward to speaking to you next week.
Chapter 7. Rationally, Doc understood how he had gotten where he was and why he was there. Emotionally, however, he felt something was wrong. No more than a month ago, he and the others had left the arena singing triumphantly about saving the world, and now, here he was, working on a farm. Doc did not think that a small town in the middle of nowhere was the best place in the world to organize the circle, but there were new members in the inner circle now, and they had effectively outvoted him. He suspected it made them feel better to know that they had influence, despite the fact that Doc and the others had more experience. To be sure, they had not ignored his advice. He was still the leader, but they had made one or two policy decisions that had no basis in logic, except to underline the fact that they held the majority of power in the inner circle. That was his opinion, anyway. Some of their ideas weren't that bad, but it had cost precious time and made it far more likely that they would be discovered by the authorities. In fact, if it hadn't been for the President's obsession with finding Grenademan, the circle probably would have been discovered long ago. Just what was Grenademan up to, anyway? No one could figure it out. He had been stealing random things from around the country according to the news reports, and all of the pieces just didn't add up. Grenademan certainly hadn't tried to find them, which was a shame because Doc certainly wanted to ask him a lot of questions. And how had all of this come about? Mulmo. Doc wasn't sure what Mulmo's country of origin was. He might have been Tongan or something. Mulmo spoke perfect American Midwestern English. In fact, he spoke the most educated English Doc had ever heard. Mulmo was large, and he was fat, and had hands that looked like they could crush rocks. He had to have been some kind of politician because Mulmo managed the crowd perfectly, certainly a lot better than Doc ever could. Doc turned the tractor around in a large loop and got ready for another row. Doc had never considered himself a farmer, but neither had most of the people in the town. The empty houses left by the people who had lived in and left the town long before the circle got there had made it easy to get things up to speed much faster. Doc had to admit sometimes hiding in plain sight had its advantages. Mulmo wasn't a complete fool. When the day came, there wouldn't be a steady barrage of refrigerated trucks bringing civilization a never-ending supply of groceries. Civilization was easy to take for granted until you took an inventory of all the things that you were leaving behind. They'd had to make a lot of hard choices about what their preparations were going to be, both for the short term and for the long haul. Still, they were a whole hell of a lot better off than they would have been without any warning at all. Oscar had been gone for a month now. Everyone assumed he was preparing to rescue Marv, but there were no messages from him. The circle had voted to restrict travel outside of the village, which had cut international travel plans short. Doc snapped out of his musings when he realized that he was heading toward a wooden fence at full speed. He tried to pull the brake, but it was too late. The front of the tractor slammed through the barricade with ease, but the splintered remains got caught in the tractor's workings toward the back. A large piece of wood caught at precisely the moment he reached for the lever, making the tractor pitch forward on both wheels. Doc hurtled through the air into some nearby rocks. When he woke up, he realized that most of the day had come and gone. Yet one more wasted day. Would someone be looking for him? He hadn't thought of that contingency. Where in the hell was he? He looked around. Just the barn. Good. Still not hell. The time was coming soon now, and everyone was getting nervous. They had prepared as much as they could, but no one really believed it was enough. He stood up and limped toward the house. Everything hurt, but he was pretty sure that he hadn't broken anything. Their dog, Doorstop, spotted him from the porch and ran up to him. He whined sympathetically. For a moment, Doc wished Doorstop could drag him home, but the small mutt could barely move itself, much less a grown man. Doc just kept limping toward home. Some 15 minutes late, he was forced to rest against a pile of hay bales he encountered along the way. He resented the fact that Beeves hadn't been there to pick him up, but then again, how could she? She had a full-time job working in the gun factory. They were going to need a lot of guns, and the government was keeping a very close eye on who bought what and where. They might be able to find some things through the black market. Indeed, they had done just that with some of the heavier military hardware, but for rifles and sawed-off shotguns, they had to make do with their own collective 2 hands. She wasn't due home for another 2 hours, well after sundown. There was no one to get him out of this but himself. With a massive effort of will, he braced against the pain and stood. Doorstop barked and whined appropriately. The winter was fading, and the hint of spring was in the air. It was just a hint, but it was a warm and welcome wind. It felt much better than the cold that hung over the town menacingly. This spring would bring not a renewal of life, but a perversion thereof. He finally made it to the house and went inside to wait for Beeves. The screen door automatically slammed behind him. The sun was rising for yet another day in which Michelle would grow to hate her roommates even more. Without Marv, she was not considered part of a couple, so she had been forced to share her house with 2 other women, Hila and Farah. Both of them were quite vapid. Farah had been with the circle since the beginning, but they'd picked up Hila at the convention. They found that they had a lot of things in common, primarily a shared hatred of Michelle. Michelle wasn't sure what had made Farah start acting so nasty, but Hila had always been that way. Michelle suspected that part of the other woman's hatred for her was Michelle's close friendship with Doc. Hila knew Mulmo quite well, so there was probably some bullshit power play going on that Michelle didn't care about. About the only thing that she was enjoying these days was the fact that she was able to work on setting and designing defensive traps around the town. At first, it had seemed like exactly the wrong kind of job for her. She was a great graphic designer, not an engineer. But when the inner circle had teamed her up with Kevin, they had been able to direct a lot of the others in setting up more and more elaborate defenses. She had discovered, through the work, that she had a rather vicious mind. Of course, one problem about designing traps was that they didn't really know what kind of zombies Jarvie would send after them. That had meant that she'd had to be flexible and creative, assuming the zombies would possess both stupidity and intelligence. It had been quite a challenge, but she'd been up to it. The Circle had chosen the town not just because of its isolation, but because of the features of the surrounding landscape. It was some 20 miles from the Mississippi River, which let them ship all kinds of cargo up the river without attracting too much unwanted attention. There were also 2 or 3 reservoirs close by that they could use for water in case of a long-term rebuilding effort. The fact that the area was riddled with abandoned factories was also a very nice perk. They'd also been able to salvage equipment that other people had just abandoned. Still, they weren't without problems. Every time they'd run a simulation in one part of the town, the zombies had been killed. The main problem was that they couldn't put up the defensive wall until things started to fall apart. While the government was mostly tied up with stupid shit like trying to track down Grenademan, they still had their eye out to stomp all over anyone who acted too much like a survivalist. Unless you actually were a survivalist, of course, in which case you got extra government funding to help you increase your supplementary governmental patriot militia. Michelle didn't pay attention to politics anymore. "Michelle, did you leave your underwear in the bathroom again?" Hila's shrill voice filled the house. "I had to get the phone. I'm coming right back up." Michelle tried to avoid picking up the kitchen knife. She used one hand to hold the pillow and the other to drum the counter next to the phone. She was not going to stab Hila. She might, however, accidentally unleash a zombie on her or something. But for now, they needed Hila's ability with electronics, even if she was really annoying. "You're so disgusting, Michelle," Farah said as she ate her Special K. She was Momo's secretary. Michelle ignored them and returned to finish her shower. She got dressed and headed out the door as quickly as she could. Her clothing probably didn't flatter her at the moment, but the blood of her roommates probably wouldn't accessorize well with her skin tones either. She drove to the edge of town and parked on the side of the road. Kevin was already there with the work crew. Their current idea involved a series of small pits with flammable gas jets at the bottom. Momo had insisted that all of the traps have a safety switch, so they couldn't be activated until the inner circle gave their okay. In theory, Michelle knew this was a good idea, but in practice, she just thought it made the job even more complicated. The crew dug a small hole about 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. using some construction equipment from the town quarry. The average time on a hole had been about a half hour, but with Kevin's off-the-wall suggestions, they were down to about 15 minutes at this point. Kevin carefully set the small propane tank at the bottom with the pressure plate. He then climbed up out of the hole and placed the camouflage trapdoor with the remote-controlled safety switch on it. Then he covered it up, swept dirt around it, and then directed the crew to the next hole. The other half of the crew added the leftover dirt to the berm around the town. All Michelle could say was that they had better hope that Mulmo wasn't killed with the security detonator, or the whole town would be defenseless. Sometimes she thought bringing more people into the circle had been the dumbest decision that she'd ever made. Momo talked about people dying from landmines decades later, but right now they had to worry about living through today.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Thomas Ricks. Music by Melanie Ricks. Voices by Skip Huffman and Josie Bergen-Lawson. Copyright 2015, Red Anvil Amalgamated, LLC. All products available on Amazon.com and other markets.
To fight the forces of evil!